Imagine waking up to find out that two of America's biggest trade partners have just declared economic war. That is exactly what is happening right now, and the consequences are about to hit your wallet. President Donald Trump thought his tariffs on Mexico and Canada would force them to bow to U.S. demands. Instead, they hit back hard. Both countries have slapped massive retaliatory tariffs on American goods, triggering a full-scale trade war. And it is not just them. India, China, and the BRICS nations are making their own moves to sideline the U.S. economy. So what happens now? Will Trump's tariffs crush the American economy? Will Mexico and Canada abandon U.S. trade altogether? And is the United States on the verge of losing its global economic dominance? What's happening? In a dramatic and unexpected move, President Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on all imports from Mexico and Canada, and a 10% tariff on goods coming from China. He framed the decision as a bold step to protect American jobs, claiming that foreign countries had been taking advantage of the United States for decades. But this was more than just a policy shift. Trump declared that these tariffs were a national security measure, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to bypass Congress. This meant he was treating economic trade disputes as an immediate national emergency, allowing him to override existing trade agreements, including the very deal he had once championed, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. His message was clear: either they comply with his demands or they suffer the consequences. But while Trump was celebrating his aggressive move, his biggest trade partners were not about to back down. If he thought they would simply accept the tariffs without retaliation, he was gravely mistaken. But instead of giving in, Mexico and Canada had their own plans, and their response was swift. Canada and Mexico strike back. Within hours of Trump's tariff announcement, Canada and Mexico responded, not with words, but with countermeasures that would hit the United States where it hurt the most. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Mexico's newly elected President Claudia Sheinbaum held emergency press conferences, making it clear that they would not be bullied into submission. Trudeau announced retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of American goods. The first wave of these tariffs, $30 billion worth, would go into effect immediately, with another $125 billion following within 21 days. The tariffs targeted key U.S. industries, including steel, aluminum, and agricultural products. American manufacturers were now facing crippling price increases, and farmers who depended on Canadian and Mexican buyers were suddenly left in limbo. Mexico followed suit, imposing harsh restrictions on U.S. exports, particularly on corn, soybeans, and auto parts, industries that directly affect the heart of Trump's voter base in the Midwest. The impact was immediate, with U.S. agricultural and auto industry leaders warning of severe losses. But Trudeau revealed an even more shocking detail. Trump had refused to take his calls for weeks. The Canadian Prime Minister explained that he had been desperately trying to reach Trump to discuss the situation diplomatically, but the U.S. president ignored every attempt at conversation. Instead, Trump had chosen to escalate tensions through social media and unilateral policy changes. In a bold statement directed at American voters, Trudeau warned that these tariffs were not just a Canada problem. They would soon be an American problem. He looked straight into the cameras and told Americans to brace for higher prices, lost jobs, and economic instability. But this wasn't just about tariffs. This was the start of an all-out trade war, the supply chain crisis. The ripple effects of Trump's tariffs weren't just political. They were about to wreak havoc on the U.S. economy. The tariffs created an immediate supply chain crisis, putting major American industries at risk. The auto industry was the first to sound the alarm. Honda and Toyota, which operate massive factories in the United States, warned that if supply chain costs skyrocketed, they might have to shut down North American production. These companies rely heavily on parts imported from Canada and Mexico, and with tariffs raising prices by 25%, their entire business model was under threat. Agriculture was next. Farmers in the Midwest, many of whom had supported Trump, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Mexico and Canada were among the largest buyers of American corn, soybeans, and beef. And now they were cutting back on purchases. Farmers who had already faced difficulties due to previous trade wars with China now had no major buyers left, pushing them toward potential bankruptcy. Small businesses that relied on affordable materials from Mexico and Canada were also scrambling. Everything from construction materials to electronics became more expensive overnight, forcing companies to either raise prices or cut jobs to stay afloat. Even large retail chains began warning of massive price hikes. Walmart and Target, which source a significant percentage of their products from China, Canada, and Mexico, stated that consumers would feel the pain almost immediately. But if Trump thought the damage would be limited to Mexico and Canada, he was gravely mistaken. China joins the fight. If Trump's tariffs had remained a North American issue, the damage might have been somewhat containable. But that wasn't the case. China, already locked in a tense economic battle with the United States, saw an opportunity to strike back. Beijing wasted no time. It formally lodged a complaint with the World Trade Organization, arguing that Trump's tariffs were an illegal economic attack. But China didn't stop at legal disputes. It began crafting its own response. China's first move was to threaten economic sanctions on American tech companies. Silicon Valley giants like Apple and Tesla, which rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing and supply chains, faced the possibility of massive cost increases or even restrictions on their operations in China. The second blow came in the form of reduced U.S. exports. China announced it was cutting purchases of American soybeans, aircraft, and machinery, diverting these contracts to European and South American suppliers. This directly impacted Boeing, Caterpillar, and U.S. agricultural industries, further deepening the economic crisis. For the first time, Mexico, Canada, and China were now unified against the United States. Trump's belief that he could divide and conquer his trade rivals had completely backfired. Instead of isolating these countries, he had given them a reason to work together against him. Economists began warning of an economic downturn, with projections indicating that inflation, job losses, and manufacturing slowdowns were inevitable. Stock markets reacted negatively, with major indexes experiencing sharp declines as investors worried about rising costs and trade uncertainty. And now, the effects are about to hit American consumers hard. The inflation explosion. When Donald Trump imposed his tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, he promised that these measures would strengthen the United States economy by forcing foreign nations to comply with his trade demands. However, the reality of tariffs is far different from what Trump claimed. Tariffs do not punish other countries. They increase prices for American consumers. When tariffs are placed on imports, companies do not simply absorb the costs. Instead, they pass them down to businesses and consumers, making everything more expensive. The result? A massive surge in the cost of cars, electronics, groceries, and fuel, everyday necessities that millions of Americans rely on. Take the auto industry, for example. The United States imports a large portion of its automobile parts from Mexico and Canada. With a 25% tariff now in place, manufacturers have no choice but to increase the cost of production. That means new and used car prices will skyrocket, leaving American consumers paying thousands more for vehicles. The same applies to electronics. The United States depends on China for computer chips, smartphones, and essential components. With a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, the cost of laptops, televisions, and home appliances will rise significantly. Even something as simple as a household refrigerator could become a luxury for many families. Grocery stores will also see major price hikes. The United States imports billions of dollars in agricultural products from Mexico and Canada, including fresh vegetables, fruits, and meat. The new tariffs will force retailers to either raise prices or absorb the costs. But with inflation already straining businesses, most will have no choice but to pass the burden on to consumers. And then there's fuel. The United States imports oil and refined petroleum from Canada, and while domestic production has increased, the sudden rise in tariffs is disrupting supply chains. Experts predict that gasoline prices will climb, making everyday commutes and travel more expensive for millions of Americans. Economists warn that these price increases could add up to billions of dollars in additional costs for United States households. In an economy where many families are already struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living, Trump's trade war is making things worse. Instead of boosting the economy, tariffs are accelerating inflation, something the Federal Reserve has been desperately trying to control. But it's not just prices. This trade war could cost millions of jobs, job losses and factory closures. For decades, American presidents have tried to strengthen domestic industries by promoting free trade agreements that allow businesses to expand their markets. Tariffs do the exact opposite. They create an economic environment that forces companies to cut costs, shut down factories, and lay off workers. Trump's tariffs have already triggered warnings from major U.S. manufacturers. Companies in the automobile, electronics, and retail sectors are now bracing for financial strain, and the consequences could be devastating. The United States auto industry is one of the hardest hit. Automakers like General Motors, Ford, Toyota, and Honda have deep supply chain ties to Mexico and Canada. With the new tariffs, the cost of producing vehicles in North America is set to rise dramatically. As a result, automakers may be forced to reduce production and cut jobs, something they have already hinted at in response to the new trade policies. In the retail sector, the situation is just as alarming. Walmart, the largest retailer in the United States, has publicly stated that tariffs will increase the prices of thousands of products, forcing them to reevaluate supply chains and adjust inventory. Retailers have little choice, either pass the cost to consumers or cut expenses elsewhere, which often means layoffs and store closures. The agriculture industry is also in trouble. Many American farmers rely on exporting their crops to Mexico and Canada, but retaliatory tariffs from these nations will severely limit market access. When tariffs disrupt agricultural exports, farmers are left with massive surpluses of unsold goods, leading to financial losses and bankruptcies. These job losses extend beyond specific industries. As supply chains weaken and consumer demand drops, small businesses that rely on imported goods will also suffer. Whether it's a local hardware store, electronics retailer, or food supplier, these businesses are now facing financial uncertainty, which could result in widespread layoffs and closures. Trump promised tariffs would bring jobs back to the United States, but the reality is that they are destroying American jobs at an alarming rate. Manufacturing and retail workers, farmers, and small business owners are now paying the price for his reckless trade policies. And as job losses mount, Trump's economic strategy is starting to unravel. Republican silence. It's no secret that many Republican lawmakers have been hesitant to publicly criticize Trump. But behind closed doors, the conversation is different. Many of them privately admit that the tariffs are a disaster. The reason? They know that Trump's trade war is hurting their own constituents, the very people who voted for them. Farmers, manufacturers, and business owners across the United States are struggling, and yet, Republican leaders remain silent. Some lawmakers understand the economic risks and have even warned Trump about the negative consequences of these tariffs. Yet they fear speaking out because they know that any criticism of Trump could cost them political support. Instead of defending their voters, they are protecting their own political careers. Even Trump's own economic advisors warned against this move. Many of them urged him to consider the long-term consequences of a trade war with Canada, Mexico, and China. But Trump, known for his aggressive, combative approach to policy, ignored their advice and pushed forward with tariffs anyway. For now, most Republican lawmakers are staying quiet, hoping that the economic damage won't escalate before the next election. But the silence is deafening, and their refusal to act is not going unnoticed. But as backlash grows, even Trump's biggest allies are starting to turn on him. The public turns against Trump. For years, Trump has relied on his ability to rally his base by promising economic growth, job creation, and financial security. But with prices rising and jobs disappearing, many Americans are starting to question whether he has their best interests at heart. Polls now show that a majority of Americans oppose tariffs when they increase costs for consumers. The backlash is not just coming from Democrats. Even Republican voters are frustrated by the economic impact. Business leaders and labor unions, two groups that rarely align, are now united against Trump's trade policies. Corporate executives are warning that economic instability could slow growth, while labor unions are fighting to protect jobs that are now at risk. Perhaps most surprising is that even Trump's base is beginning to waver. Many of his most loyal supporters are farmers, factory workers, and small business owners, the very people who are bearing the brunt of these tariffs. While some still stand by him, others are beginning to realize that his policies are making their lives harder, not better. As the economic fallout worsens, Trump is refusing to acknowledge the damage. Instead of adjusting course, he is doubling down on the chaos, threatening even higher tariffs and more aggressive trade measures. As Trump escalates his trade war, the economic consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. But history has already shown us what happens when tariffs spiral out of control. The 1929 stock market crash. The Great Depression remains one of the darkest economic periods in American history, and tariffs played a major role in making it worse. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, passed in 1929, was meant to protect American businesses by raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Instead of boosting the economy, it triggered a global trade war. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, making it nearly impossible for American manufacturers and farmers to sell their products overseas. As international trade collapsed, U.S. companies that relied on exports faced devastating losses. Businesses shut down, workers were laid off, and the stock market plummeted. By 1932, U.S. exports had dropped by more than 60%, and unemployment soared to 25%. The economy was in free fall, and it took more than a decade and World War II to recover fully. Economists today fear that Trump's tariffs could set off a similar economic disaster. His decision to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, along with 10% tariffs on China, is already sparking retaliatory measures. The Great Depression proved that reckless tariff policies can devastate industries, but it seems like history is repeating itself. One of the hardest hit sectors today? The auto industry. And just like in the past, companies are sounding the alarm before it's too late. The auto industry's warning. When Trump first experimented with tariffs in 2018, he targeted steel and aluminum imports, arguing that it would help U.S. industries grow. The reality was far different. Major automakers, including Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, saw their production costs skyrocket due to the higher price of raw materials. Instead of gaining an advantage, American companies struggled to compete as the cost of making cars spiked overnight. Ford estimated that Trump's steel tariffs cost them nearly $1 billion, while General Motors saw similar losses. Companies were forced to cut jobs, delay expansion plans, and increase vehicle prices to compensate for the financial hit. The tariffs ultimately hurt American manufacturing instead of protecting it, proving to be a failed economic strategy. Now, with Trump reintroducing even harsher tariffs, automakers fear a repeat of the 2018 disaster. This time, the consequences could be even worse. If the tariffs remain in place, supply chain disruptions could force manufacturers to move production overseas to avoid the rising costs. Instead of creating American jobs, Trump's policies might drive them away. And once again, Trump is ignoring the experts and making the same mistakes. The China trade war, Trump's first trade war with China, was a financial disaster for the United States. He imposed massive tariffs on Chinese goods, believing it would pressure China into making trade concessions. Instead, China fought back by imposing its own tariffs on American exports, particularly targeting agriculture and technology. While Trump boasted that the tariffs would bring manufacturing back to the U.S., the reality was that American businesses and consumers bore the brunt of the costs. The tariffs led to higher prices on everyday goods, from electronics to household appliances. More importantly, farmers suffered immensely as China drastically reduced its imports of American crops, forcing the U.S. government to spend billions in bailout money just to keep the agricultural sector afloat. China played the long game, waiting Trump out while relying on state subsidies to absorb the economic blow. Meanwhile, U.S. businesses struggled, and American consumers ended up paying more for products. Trump's strategy failed, and instead of backing down, China strengthened its ties with Europe, Russia, and other global partners, making the U.S. less influential in international trade. Now Trump is repeating the same failed strategy, but this time he has even fewer options. China is economically stronger than it was a few years ago, while the U.S. is still recovering from supply chain disruptions and inflationary pressures. Experts warn that if China retaliates again, American companies will take another massive hit, one that could push the U.S. closer to a recession. But Trump's real goal might not be winning, it might just be revenge. The political strategy is Trump using tariffs for votes. Some experts believe Trump's tariffs aren't about economics at all. They're about politics. His core voter base has long been drawn to his America First rhetoric, and tariffs allow him to appear strong on trade, even if they ultimately hurt the economy. The real economic impact of these tariffs won't be fully felt until after the election, making it a calculated move. By that time, Trump hopes to have already secured re-election, leaving the long-term consequences for the next administration to handle. This strategy mirrors his approach in 2016, when he made bold economic promises that never materialized but kept his supporters engaged. However, this political gamble could backfire. Unlike previous elections, American consumers are already struggling with high prices, and tariffs could make things even worse. If inflation rises and jobs disappear, voters could turn against him, especially in key swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where manufacturing and trade directly impact local economies. Even within his own party, concerns are growing. Many Republican lawmakers privately oppose the tariffs, recognizing the economic risks, but they fear backlash from Trump's base if they speak out. If the trade war spirals out of control, it could become one of the biggest political miscalculations of Trump's career. As North America's once solid economic foundation begins to crack, the question remains, is the United States losing its closest allies in trade? And they're not the only ones looking for new trade partners. India's quiet shift. While much of the world's attention is focused on the trade war between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, India has been quietly making its own moves. Over the past few years, India has strategically distanced itself from U.S. trade policies, instead choosing to strengthen its economic relationships with China and the European Union. One of the most significant developments has been the creation of the India-Europe Trade Corridor, a multi-billion-dollar project designed to establish a direct trade route between India and Europe, bypassing traditional U.S.-centric partnerships. This corridor is expected to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative, providing a new economic artery that reduces India's reliance on American markets. India has also been expanding its trade agreements with China, despite geopolitical tensions. Chinese investments in India's infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing have grown steadily, making China one of India's top trading partners. This move signals that India is preparing for a future where the United States is no longer the dominant economic force. For decades, the United States has relied on India as a strategic trade ally, especially in countering China's growing influence. But with Trump's unpredictable tariffs and economic policies, India is now hedging its bets, ensuring that it has stronger ties with global powers beyond the United States. If this shift continues, it could reshape global trade networks for decades to come. And while India is making quiet moves, another alliance is forming against Trump's tariffs. The BRICS Challenge, a new economic bloc. As Trump continues his trade war, another major economic force is rising. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This coalition, originally formed as an emerging market alliance, has evolved into something much more significant, a direct challenge to U.S. trade dominance. China and Russia in particular are leading efforts to create alternative financial and trade systems that bypass U.S. influence. The BRICS countries have developed their own international payment system, reducing reliance on the U.S. dollar in global transactions. This shift could undermine America's financial leverage over global trade. Brazil and South Africa have also strengthened trade agreements with China and India, ensuring that their economies are less vulnerable to U.S. tariffs and sanctions. With Russia openly defying U.S. economic policies and forging deeper trade ties with Asia, the BRICS nations are positioning themselves as an alternative economic powerhouse. Many economists now warn that BRICS could pose a real threat to U.S. economic leadership. If these nations continue to reduce their dependence on American markets, the United States could face a long-term decline in global trade influence. This shift would not only weaken America's position as the world's largest economy, but also force U.S. businesses to compete in a global market where American influence is no longer guaranteed. So where does this leave the United States? And more importantly, what happens next? The verdict. Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen the U.S. economy and force other nations into submission. Instead, they have triggered a global backlash, isolating the United States from key trading partners and weakening America's economic position. Mexico and Canada are now forging new alliances with Europe and Asia, reducing their reliance on U.S. trade. India is expanding its economic relationships with China and the European Union, ensuring that its future is not tied to American policies. The BRICS nations are actively building an economic system that bypasses U.S. influence, creating a new financial and trade network that could undermine America's global power. This is not just about tariffs anymore. It is about the future of U.S. economic dominance. Trump's approach to trade is accelerating a global shift where countries are learning to prosper without relying on the United States. If this trend continues, the long-term consequences could be disastrous for American businesses, workers, and consumers. The biggest question now is whether the United States can reverse course before it is too late. Can American leaders repair relationships with Canada, Mexico, and India? Can the U.S. maintain its position as the dominant global trade power? Or will it be pushed aside by rising economic blocs like BRICS? One thing is clear, the world is changing fast. and Trump's economic strategy is not working as planned. The decisions made in the coming months could reshape the global economy for decades and determine whether the United States remains a dominant force or fades into economic isolation. What do you think? Is Trump's strategy doomed, or does he have a plan? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.